The envelope arrived on a Thursday, unremarkable in every way except for the weight of it, heavier than paper alone should be, as if it carried within it something more substantial than mere documentation. No return address, no postmark indicating origin, simply my name written in careful block letters, the kind of handwriting that suggests deliberation, that speaks of someone taking time to ensure clarity. I have spent my entire career as a curator of difficult histories, a woman trained to read the silences in archives, to understand what photographs conceal even as they appear to reveal. So when I opened this envelope, I was already prepared for disappointment. Most unsolicited historical materials are either forgeries or misidentifications, the desperate hope of families seeking to insert their suffering into the grand narrative of documented trauma. But this image, the moment I held it in my hands, demanded something different. It demanded attention in a way that felt almost physical. The photograph showed two soldiers standing in what appeared to be the courtyard of a French chateau, 1944, based on the uniforms and the quality of the film stock. Late summer, perhaps early autumn. The light had that particular golden quality that comes after the worst heat has passed but before winter imposes its gray discipline. The two men were young, American by their uniforms, standing at what might generously be called parade rest, though their posture suggested something closer to exhaustion, held upright by pure will. The soldier on the left wore the rank of sergeant, the one on the right a private. They were separated by perhaps 2 feet of space. That careful distance military protocol demands between individuals of different rank. This was all entirely ordinary. Thousands of such photographs exist. Routine documentation of military personnel in occupied territories, bureaucratic records of presence and position. I might have filed it away as unremarkable if my eyes had not been drawn to what existed in the background, visible but somehow easy to overlook if you were not specifically searching for the incongruous. Behind the two soldiers, visible through the ornate windows of the chateau, was a fire. Not a small fire, not a contained fire, but a substantial conflagration. Flames visible even in broad daylight, orange and yellow against the pale stone interior of what had clearly once been a place of beauty and significance. The fire was positioned directly behind them, as if they were standing before it deliberately, as if they were using their own bodies as some kind of visual barrier or testimony. I turned the photograph over. On the back, written in the same careful hand that had addressed the envelope, "They stood there while it burned. They wanted someone to know they chose to watch it burn. They wanted someone to know why." Below this, a date, August 15, 1944, Château de Montfort, Normandy. And then, in a different hand, someone else's notation, older by perhaps decades. I don't know who sent this, but I knew these men. And I knew what they had been ordered to do. The photograph is the only proof that they refused. My hands were trembling as I set the photograph on my desk. This was not a military document. This was testimony. This was evidence of something that the official record had apparently deemed unimportant, or perhaps deliberately concealed. Two soldiers who had apparently been ordered to participate in something they found abhorrent. Two soldiers who had apparently refused and who had asked someone, some future witness, some unknown photographer, to preserve that refusal for history to eventually discover. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was looking at a moment that had been hidden for 80 years, and I understood that uncovering the story behind it would require me to venture into territory that official history preferred to leave undocumented. I reached for my phone to call my contact at the National Archives, and I understood that this ordinary photograph of two soldiers standing still was about to become the center of my life. Bloco 2. O detalle extraño. 1. 195 palabras. The more closely I examined the photograph over the following days, subjecting it to magnification, to spectral analysis, to every technique available to modern archival forensics, the more details emerged that deepened the mystery and complicated any simple interpretation of what I was seeing. The fire in the background was not random. Upon closer inspection, I could identify the silhouettes of objects within the flames, the curved back of what might have been a chair, the geometric form of shelving, the distinctive shape of a large frame. Art, perhaps, paintings being destroyed. The realization brought a new dimension of horror to the image. This was not merely a building burning. This was the systematic destruction of cultural property, and these two soldiers had apparently been commanded to participate in that destruction. But what arrested my attention most profoundly was their faces. The sergeant on the left bore an expression of what I can only describe as controlled fury. His jaw was clenched so tightly that I could see the muscle tensing at his temples. His eyes were fixed on the camera, but not with the standard military bearing one sees in official documentation. His gaze was direct, almost accusatory, as if he was staring at some future witness and demanding, "Do you understand what I was ordered to do? Do you understand that I refused?" The private on the right had a different expression entirely. His face was wet with tears. Not subtle moisture on the cheeks, but streaming tears, the kind that comes from profound emotional distress held barely in check. And yet his body remained rigid. His arms hung at his sides with military precision. He was performing the role of soldier, even as his tears testified to something the role could not contain. Between them, barely visible, unless you knew to look for it, was a small detail that seemed almost impossibly significant. Their hands. The sergeant's right hand appeared to be extended slightly toward the private, as if they had been holding each other, as if they had been supporting each other, and only separated moments before the photograph was taken, separated by the camera operator who had required them to stand at proper military distance for the formal record. I consulted with Dr. Elena Rossi at the Istituto Storico Germanico in Rome, a specialist in European art theft during the war. She examined high-resolution scans of the photograph and confirmed my suspicion within the hour. "This is documentation of the systematic looting of cultural property," she had said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Specifically, I would guess, the confiscation and destruction of what the Nazis deemed degenerate art. The modern works, the Jewish artists, the pieces that didn't fit Nazi aesthetic ideology. Those soldiers were likely ordered to supervise the destruction. And if they're documenting their refusal through this photograph, then this is potentially a record of resistance, passive resistance, but resistance nonetheless." I reached out to a colleague at the Army Center of Military History, Colonel Robert Vasquez, and described the uniforms, the insignia, the architectural details visible in the photograph. Within a week, he had provided me with preliminary identification. The chateau had been requisitioned by the Nazi occupation force as a repository for confiscated art. The soldiers' unit could be identified through the insignia visible in the photograph. The 7th Army Corps, assigned to occupation duties in this region of Normandy. But when I requested documentation of specific orders issued to this unit in August 1944, the response was less forthcoming. There were files, Vasquez explained, but they had been classified and then declassified and then reclassified in ways that made their retrieval complicated. Some materials had been destroyed as part of standard record disposal. Others remained in archives that required special clearance to access. The implication was clear. Someone, somewhere, had wanted these records to be difficult to find. I began researching the Château de Montfort itself. The building had been constructed in the 17th century as a nobleman's residence. During the occupation, it had been seized and converted into a storage facility for confiscated artwork. After liberation, it had been briefly used as a temporary museum and repository for recovering stolen pieces. But the chateau had burned in early 1945, officially documented as an accident, though the details remained vague. 63 pieces of art that had been stored there were lost in the fire, creating a permanent gap in the historical record of what the Nazis had stolen from French collections. It was this gap, this official accident, that the photograph seemed to challenge. If these two soldiers had intentionally documented their presence at the destruction of the artwork, if they had deliberately asked a photographer to capture their refusal to participate, then the burning of the chateau might not have been an accident at all. It might have been deliberate destruction authorized by soldiers who understood that the art could not be recovered through official channels, and who had made the decision to ensure its destruction was at least witnessed and documented as an act of defiance. The private's tears began to make sense to me in a new way. They were not the tears of someone forced to participate in destruction. They were the tears of someone who understood the magnitude of what was being lost. Artwork created by artists, many of whom were now dead, victims of the Nazi ideology those soldiers were meant to serve. Those tears were grief. And standing in front of that burning chateau, allowing a photographer to capture that grief, That was an act of resistance. I began searching for the names of the soldiers. The photograph was too degraded to allow for certain facial identification, but combined with unit records and the date and location, I had enough information to begin querying databases, and slowly, methodically, names began to emerge from the historical record. Names of men who had served in that unit, who had been assigned to Normandy in August 1944, who had disappeared from official documentation after the liberation of France. One name appeared repeatedly in fragmentary records, Sergeant James Mitchell from Youngstown, Ohio, and beside him in multiple surviving unit rosters, Private Daniel Kaufman from Brooklyn, New York. I began the search for their descendants, understanding that these two men, if my identification was correct, had apparently spent the rest of their lives carrying a secret, a refusal. A moment of standing before burning art and choosing to let it burn, rather than allow it to serve the Nazi regime's purposes. A moment of subtle resistance that official history had apparently deemed irrelevant or dangerous enough to bury. The trail led me first to Youngstown, Ohio, to a woman named Margaret Mitchell Hayes, the granddaughter of Sergeant James Mitchell. She was 91 years old, living in a care facility but still possessed of sharp mental faculties and a fierce protective instinct regarding family history. When I explained the reason for my visit, she wept. "My grandfather never spoke about the war," she had said, her hands trembling as I showed her the photograph. "My father asked him repeatedly when he was young to tell stories about the war, but grandfather would always change the subject. He would say that some things were better left buried. I assumed it was trauma. So many of the men from that generation carried trauma they couldn't process. But now," she had held the photograph for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked up, her eyes were clear. "My grandfather kept a diary. He didn't leave it to my father. He left it to me, with specific instructions that I was not to read it until I was old enough to understand that history is more complicated than official records suggest. I read it when I was 30. It devastated me, but I kept it secret because he had asked me to. He said that some truths were dangerous to the people who had witnessed them, and that if I truly loved him, I would understand why he needed that silence." She stood slowly and retrieved a small leather journal from a desk drawer. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting occasionally difficult to read, but the content was absolutely clear. James Mitchell had maintained a detailed record of his time in Normandy, and specifically of the events of August 15th, 1944. The entries documented with increasing distress the occupation force's systematic looting of French cultural property. Mitchell had apparently been assigned to supervise the cataloging and storage of confiscated artwork. But in mid-August, new orders had arrived. The Nazis, anticipating that the liberation of France was inevitable, had decided that the artwork should be destroyed rather than recovered by Allied forces. Mitchell was ordered to supervise the destruction. According to his diary, Mitchell had refused. His entry for August 14, 1944 read, "I cannot participate in the destruction of beauty. I cannot be the instrument through which humanity loses pieces of itself. I spoke to Daniel. He agrees. We have decided. Tomorrow, we will refuse. We will stand before what is being destroyed, and we will ask someone to witness our refusal. If they shoot us for insubordination, so be it. Some things matter more than survival." The entry for August 15th was brief. "It is done. We refused. We stood there. We did not lay a hand on the flames." Daniel wept. I held him after. A photographer, I don't know his name, I don't know his allegiance, captured the moment. We asked him to preserve it. He said he would. He said that someday someone would understand what this meant. I hope he was right. And then, 5 days later, an entry that broke my heart. We were not punished. The officer in charge of the destruction apparently appreciated our position. He understood that some men cannot participate in the eradication of culture. Instead of court-martial, we were transferred. Our refusal has been documented in a report, but the report has apparently been classified. The officer told me that history will determine whether our actions were heroic or traitorous. For now, we simply remained silent. Margaret Hayes provided me with the address of Daniel Kaufman's family in Brooklyn. It took 3 days of searching, following traces through city directories and property records, but I eventually found his nephew, David Kaufman, who was 93 years old and living in the same neighborhood where his uncle had lived after the war. David's memory was less sharp than Margaret's, but his emotional response to the photograph was immediate and overwhelming. "My uncle never married," David said, his voice shaking. "He lived alone, worked as a librarian, seemed to exist in a kind of quiet sadness that we all assumed was trauma from the war. But when he died, I found letters in his apartment, dozens of them, written to someone named James, never sent, and in the margins of some of them he had written about a moment at a chateau in France, about choosing to refuse, about standing before burning art and deciding that his conscience mattered more than his military duty." David retrieved a box of letters he had preserved, and I spent an entire afternoon reading Daniel Kaufman's words. They documented a deep emotional connection to James Mitchell, whether romantic or simply the profound bond that forms between men who share a moral crisis. The letters left ambiguous. But what was clear was that Daniel had spent his entire life processing the choice they had made together. He had become a librarian, apparently, as a way of honoring the destroyed artwork, preserving knowledge, preserving culture, working to ensure that what was lost was at least remembered. One letter, dated 1987 and apparently never sent, read, "I have lived 70 years since we stood before those flames. I have built a life around the principle that we acted upon in that moment, that culture is sacred, that beauty matters, that sometimes the most important resistance is the refusal to participate in destruction. I don't know if we were heroes or fools, but I know that if I had picked up one piece of burning canvas, if I had assisted in the erasure of even one artwork, I would have been complicit in something unforgivable. You taught me that, James. You taught me that conscience is more important than obedience. I wish I had told you directly instead of writing these words that you will never read. I discovered, through Army records that had recently been declassified, that James Mitchell had survived the war and returned to Youngstown, where he had lived a quiet life as a factory foreman, had married, had raised children, and had died in 1989. Daniel Kaufman had lived until 1995 in Brooklyn, never married, maintained his position as a librarian, and had apparently constructed his entire post-war life around honoring the moment of refusal he and James had shared in 1944. But I still did not know who had taken the photograph, who had been the operator of the camera that morning at the Chateau de Montfort, and more importantly, who had sent it to me now, 80 years later, apparently determined that this moment of resistance be finally recognized. The answer came from an unexpected source, a woman named Simone Mercier, now 98 years old, living in a small town outside Paris. She had seen my inquiry posted on a war history forum, and she had written to me with information that proved to be the final piece of the puzzle. I was the photographer, her letter read. I was 17 years old, working for a French resistance cell that was secretly documenting Nazi art theft. The Americans standing in front of the burning chateau, I knew what they were doing the moment I saw them refuse to participate. I took the photograph as they requested. I have kept it safe for 80 years, waiting for the right moment, the right person to finally present it to history. You seem to be that person. Simone and I corresponded for months. She provided details about the resistance network she had worked with, about how the photograph had been preserved, about why she had chosen this specific moment to send it to me. She explained that she was dying, cancer, she said, quite matter-of-factly, and that she could no longer carry the weight of this secret. She needed someone to ensure that James Mitchell and Daniel Kaufman were remembered not as soldiers who had merely survived the war, but as men who had chosen conscience over obedience in a moment when such a choice could have cost them their lives. They never knew each other again after the war, Simone wrote. The photograph was the only thing that connected them, the only proof that they had made the choice together. I am sending it to you because I believe their refusal needs to be part of the historical record. I believe that in a time when we are asked to participate in things we find abhorrent, their example matters. They showed that resistance is possible, that conscience survives. Chateau de Montfort, Normandy, August 1944. The Allied advance is accelerating. Paris will be liberated within 2 weeks. James Mitchell had not expected to become a moral actor in the Second World War. He was a factory foreman from Ohio, drafted at the age of 35, assigned to military logistics with the understanding that his job was to maintain supply chains and manage personnel. He was not a soldier in any romantic sense. He did not carry ideological convictions about the war. He had simply understood that his country needed him, and he had answered that need. But the assignment to Normandy in July 1944 had begun to complicate his understanding of what it meant to serve. The liberation of France should have been a moment of uncomplicated triumph. The Nazi occupation was ending. Freedom was being restored. But the paperwork, the endless bureaucratic documentation, told a different story. Lists of confiscated property, catalogs of stolen artwork, records of systematic cultural erasure that had been proceeding methodically for 4 years while the world fought its wars. The Château de Montfort had been converted into a repository for this stolen art. Paintings, sculptures, manuscripts, cultural artifacts of incalculable historical value, all stolen from French collectors, Jewish museums, private homes. Thousands of pieces had been collected and stored in this single building, awaiting either transport back to Germany or destruction, depending on the Nazi leadership's changing priorities. James had been assigned to supervise the documentation and storage of these materials. He had walked through the chateau's halls, past room after room of irreplaceable beauty, paintings by artists he recognized even through his limited cultural education, sculptures that suggested human genius operating at the highest possible level, manuscripts illuminated by hands that had belonged to monks centuries dead, and he had understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he was participating in something that transcended military conflict. He was participating in the systematic erasure of human culture, human creativity, human meaning-making. It was in the courtyard of the chateau that he had first met Daniel Kaufman. Daniel was a private, assigned to the same unit, given similar duties. But Daniel was different from most of the soldiers James had encountered. He was quieter, more intellectually engaged, more clearly devastated by what was being stored in the chateau. Daniel had studied art history before the war. He had written papers about Renaissance painting. He had held dreams, apparently, of becoming a museum curator, of dedicating his life to the preservation of beauty. Instead, he had been drafted and assigned to catalog the systematic destruction of the very beauty he had hoped to preserve. They had begun talking in the evenings, in the courtyard outside the chateau, watching the Normandy sun descend toward the horizon. Daniel had described in careful detail what some of the paintings represented, their historical significance, their artistic innovation, their irreplaceable value to human culture. And James, listening to this young man's passionate description of beauty being destroyed, had begun to understand that his participation in this process was not morally neutral. He was not merely following orders. He was choosing, through his compliance, to be complicit in cultural annihilation. On August 14th, Daniel had approached him with a proposal that was almost terrifying in its implications. "New orders came in today," Daniel had said quietly. "The command decision has been made. The artwork cannot be transported. The occupation is ending. So the order is destruction. We're supposed to supervise the burning of everything in the chateau. Tomorrow morning." James had felt something crystallize in his consciousness, a moment of absolute clarity about who he was and what he could accept about himself. He could have followed orders. He could have participated in the destruction. But in doing so, he would have become someone he did not recognize. He would have become complicit in an act of cultural annihilation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Then we refuse," he had said simply. Daniel's eyes had widened. "That's insubordination. That's court-martial. That's potentially—" "Yes," James had interrupted. "It's all of those things. But it's also the only choice that allows me to remain myself. The only choice that allows me to survive this war with my conscience intact. I'm asking you to refuse with me." Daniel had been silent for a long moment. Then he had nodded. "I'll refuse with you. But James, I need someone to know. I need some record that we chose this. Not for recognition, but because if we're going to risk our lives, I need there to be evidence that we understood what we were doing, that we weren't following orders, that we were making a choice." That's when James had thought of the photographer, a civilian, French, who had been documenting various aspects of the occupation and the Allied presence. The man had been unremarkable, moving through the camp with official credentials, taking photographs that seemed routine. But James had watched him long enough to recognize something. The photographer was also documenting resistance, was also preserving evidence of things the official record preferred to ignore. James had approached him late that evening. "Tomorrow morning," he had said, "there will be an order to destroy the contents of the chateau. I'm going to refuse to participate. A friend of mine will also refuse. We will stand in front of the chateau while the destruction is happening around us. We're asking you to photograph us. We're asking you to preserve the image. Someday someone will need to know that we chose to refuse." The photographer had looked at him for a long moment without expression. Then he had simply nodded. "I will be there," he had said. "I will photograph your refusal, and I will preserve the image for as long as I live. History will determine whether your choice was heroic or traitorous, but I will ensure that your choice is documented." The order had come at first light. The commanding officer, a man named Colonel Harrison, had assembled the unit in the courtyard. His face was grim, his voice clipped and efficient, the tone of someone transmitting bureaucratic information rather than asking for volunteers to participate in cultural destruction. "The strategic situation has changed," Harrison had said. "The chateau will be destroyed. All contents will be burned. This is a directive from higher command. We will proceed methodically and document the process. The artwork cannot be allowed to fall into the hands of looters or civilians who might attempt to claim it as their own. We will control the destruction." James had stood beside Daniel in the formation of soldiers, and he had felt Daniel's hand brush against his own. A moment of contact, of solidarity, of mutual commitment to the choice they had made. They had not spoken since that evening conversation. They had not needed to. The understanding was complete. When the order came to begin, James had stepped forward. "Sir," he had said clearly, loudly enough for other soldiers to hear, "I respectfully refuse to participate in the destruction of cultural property." The courtyard had gone silent. A few seconds stretched that felt like hours. Then Daniel had stepped forward as well. "I also refuse, sir." Colonel Harrison had studied them both for a long moment. His face had been unreadable. James could not determine if he was about to order their execution or accept their refusal. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Harrison had seemed almost to nod, almost imperceptibly. "Stand aside," he had said finally. "You will not participate. You will not be disciplined. You will simply bear witness. This is an order. You will stand where you can see what is being destroyed, and you will remember it." It was a strange mercy, or perhaps a deeper acknowledgement of something Harrison understood in that moment, that there was value in bearing witness, that there needed to be someone who could testify to the destruction, someone who could look at it with the clarity of refusal, rather than the compromised vision of participation. They had taken their positions in the courtyard, standing before the chateau's entrance. Behind them, soldiers had begun the systematic work of destruction. Paintings had been removed from the walls. James could hear the sound of canvas tearing, of frames breaking. Oil had been spread across the wooden structures, and then the fires had been set. The flames had begun slowly, catching on the oil-soaked wood, spreading gradually at first and then with accelerating intensity. The heat had become almost unbearable, even at a distance. Smoke had begun to pour from the windows, turning the morning gray and obscuring the sky. And with each moment, centuries of human creativity had been consumed. Artwork that would never be seen again, that existed now only in the memories of the few people who had seen it before the flames took it. Daniel had begun to weep, not quietly, but openly, with the deep sobs of someone watching something irreplaceable being destroyed. His shoulders had shaken, his face had contorted with grief. And James, standing beside him, had slowly extended his right hand and had taken Daniel's hand, right there in front of the other soldiers, right there in front of the flames. It had been an act of profound defiance. Physical contact between soldiers was not prohibited, but the intimacy of it, the deliberate gesture of support and solidarity, had clearly meant something to the men watching. This was not military brotherhood. This was something deeper. This was love in the fullest sense of the word. This was two men choosing to hold each other up in the face of destruction. And then the photographer had appeared. James had not planned this moment. He had simply glanced up, and there was the man, French, face obscured by the camera, documenting this instant of refusal. The photographer had nodded, and James had understood. This moment was being preserved. This refusal was being recorded. 80 years in the future, someone would see this photograph and would understand that at least 2 men had refused to participate in destruction. At least 2 men had chosen to stand aside and bear witness instead. The chateau had burned for hours. By midday, nothing remained but charred stone and ash. 37 paintings had been destroyed, 19 sculptures, 42 manuscripts, countless other pieces of cultural property that had survived centuries of war and revolution, only to be obliterated in a single morning by an occupying power that had decided that beauty was expendable. But in the photograph, the single image captured by the French photographer, there existed a record of refusal. 2 soldiers standing before the flames, one gripping the other's hand, tears streaming down a young man's face, an older man's expression hardened into resolve. The photograph did not show triumph. It did not show heroism in any conventional sense, but it showed something that mattered even more. It showed the human capacity to refuse, to stand aside, to say no to systems of destruction, even at great personal cost. The complete story emerged slowly over the course of 18 months of archival research, interviews, and the careful reconstruction of documents that had been deliberately scattered across multiple institutions to obscure their relationship to each other. The narrative that official history had preserved, or rather had attempted to suppress, was complex and morally ambiguous in ways that made it dangerous to the post-war consensus. Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer who had ordered James and Daniel to stand aside, had been court-martialed after the war for allowing the destruction of cultural property to proceed without attempting to prevent it. In his defense, he had testified that he had received explicit orders from higher command to ensure the destruction, but that he had understood intuitively that some men could not participate in such actions without being morally destroyed. He had stated that James Mitchell and Daniel Kaufman's refusal had actually strengthened his position, had provided him with evidence that even enlisted men understood the moral gravity of what was being ordered. Harrison had served 3 years of a 5-year sentence and had died in 1957. But the more significant revelation came from documents I obtained from the French National Archives. The photographer, whose name was Philippe Marchand, had been part of a resistance cell dedicated to documenting Nazi cultural theft. He had deliberately infiltrated the military occupation force as a photographer, authorized to document various aspects of the occupation. He had preserved the photograph of James and Daniel not merely as a historical document, but as evidence for potential war crimes prosecution. However, when the Nuremberg trials had concluded and the post-war world had begun to normalize, certain files had been reclassified. The photograph of James and Daniel had been deemed potentially problematic, not because it documented a crime, but because it documented American soldiers refusing orders in a context that could be seen as criticism of American military authority. During the Cold War, when military discipline and unified command were considered essential to national security, the photograph had been deliberately buried. Simone Mercier, the photographer's granddaughter, had inherited the photograph along with her grandfather's notes explaining why he had taken it and why he had chosen to preserve it. She had carried the image for 70 years, waiting for a moment when its revelation would not be politically dangerous, when historical truth could be prioritized over institutional protection of authority. James Mitchell had lived until 1989, apparently carrying the memory of that August morning with him for 45 years. According to his diary entries, he had struggled with depression, with nightmares, with a persistent sense that he had failed, not in refusing to participate in destruction, but in not doing more to prevent the destruction from happening at all. He had married a woman named Eleanor, had raised 2 children, had worked at the same factory for 42 years. By all external measures, he had lived a successful, stable post-war life. But his private journals, which his granddaughter Margaret had shared with me, revealed a man tormented by moral ambiguity. He had written repeatedly about Daniel, had expressed regret that they had lost contact after the war, that they had never been able to discuss or process their shared experience, that Daniel had apparently lived his entire life, carrying the burden of that morning alone. "I failed him," one late journal entry read. "I failed him by not reaching out after the war, by not ensuring that we could support each other through the aftermath of that moment, by allowing us to be separated by circumstance and time. If I had been braver, if I had worked harder to maintain our connection, perhaps he would not have lived in isolation." Perhaps he would not have spent his life as a librarian in Brooklyn, apparently unmarried, apparently carrying an unprocessed trauma that I alone could have helped him bear. Daniel Kaufman's life had been, by contrast, more deliberately constructed around processing the trauma and the moral weight of that moment. He had become a librarian, apparently, as an act of resistance against destruction, dedicating his professional life to the preservation of knowledge, to the prevention of cultural erasure. He had never married, though his letters to the unsent James suggested a profound emotional and possibly romantic attachment. "I chose this life," one letter read, "because I understood that the opposite of destruction is preservation. If I could not prevent the burning of the chateau, at least I could spend my life preventing the loss of knowledge. At least I could ensure that human culture was protected, archived, made available to future generations. You taught me this, James. You taught me that sometimes the most important resistance is the decision to dedicate your life to the opposite of what you have been ordered to participate in." Daniel had died in 1995, having lived to see the end of the Cold War, having apparently carried to his grave the unprocessed trauma of that August morning in 1944. His nephew David had preserved his letters, not understanding their full significance until I arrived with the photograph and the explanation. When I finally presented the complete documentation to the Army Center of Military History, the response was complicated. Officially, James Mitchell and Daniel Kaufman were recognized for their refusal to participate in the destruction of cultural property, a refusal that demonstrated individual moral agency in the face of orders. But unofficially, there was reluctance to pursue a more formal recognition of their actions. To do so would have required acknowledging that the post-war military apparatus had deliberately suppressed documentation of their refusal, and that this suppression had been motivated by political considerations rather than historical accuracy. I published the story in a major historical journal. The photograph appeared in multiple historical exhibitions. Universities began incorporating the image into courses on military ethics, on the Holocaust, on the nature of moral responsibility in warfare. Margaret Mitchell Hayes and David Kaufman both participated in documentaries about the photograph. The story gained traction among historians and the general public as an example of resistance operating in subtle but powerful forms. But the most significant moment came when I received a letter from Simone Mercier, written just 2 weeks before her death. In the letter, she explained that she had been approached by officials from the French government about designating the Château de Montfort site as a memorial to the destroyed artwork and to the 2 soldiers who had refused to participate in its destruction. "I am dying," Simone wrote. "But before I do, I wanted you to know that your work, our work really, since I sent you the photograph, has mattered. These 2 men can now be remembered not as footnotes to military history, but as examples of what it means to maintain your conscience in the face of systematic pressure to abandon it. They stood before the flames. They refused to participate in destruction. And through their refusal, they affirmed something essential about human dignity and human agency that transcends military hierarchies and political expediency. Some photographs capture more than faces. They hold the moment when conscience triumphs over obedience, when 2 people choose to refuse what systems have ordered them to accept. This image, taken on an August morning in 1944 at a chateau in Normandy, preserves within its frame a testament to the possibility of moral resistance operating in subtle but transformative ways. I have spent years now studying James Mitchell and Daniel Kaufman, not as soldiers, not as military personnel, but as human beings confronted with a choice that would define the rest of their lives. They could have participated in the destruction. They could have followed orders and never questioned them. They could have returned home after the war and lived quietly, never mentioning what they had been asked to do. Instead, they chose to refuse. They chose to stand aside. They chose to bear witness to destruction rather than participate in it. And perhaps most importantly, they chose to allow a photographer to preserve their refusal for a future that neither of them could predict. The photograph exists now as a kind of mirror, reflecting back to us questions about our own complicity, our own choices, our own responsibility in systems that ask us to participate in destruction. Every time I encounter the image, in classroom contexts, in historical exhibitions, in conversations with students and scholars, I watch people pause. I watch them confront the reality of those 2 soldiers standing before the flames, and I watch them begin to ask themselves, what would I do? In what moment would I refuse? What conscience am I willing to stake my life upon? This is not a question with an easy answer. Both James and Daniel paid a price for their refusal. James lived with depression, with guilt, with a sense that his refusal had been insufficient. Daniel lived in apparent isolation, apparently channeling his trauma into a dedication to preservation that consumed his entire life. Neither of them was recognized during their lifetime for their moral courage. Both of them carried the weight of that moment alone, separated by geography and circumstance and the post-war world's determination to forget or ignore their refusal. But their story matters precisely because it is not triumphant. It matters because it shows that moral resistance often comes at great personal cost. It matters because it demonstrates that conscience does not guarantee happiness or peace or resolution. What it guarantees is integrity, the integrity of knowing that you remained true to yourself, even when systems demanded that you abandon that self. The Château de Montfort site is now being developed as a memorial to destroyed art and to the two soldiers who refused to participate in that destruction. The photograph will be displayed there, along with James's journals, Daniel's letters, and the testimony of Philippe Marchand about why he chose to preserve this image for a future that seemed impossibly distant in 1944. What strikes me most profoundly when I encounter this photograph now is not the flames or the moral drama it documents. What strikes me is the tenderness visible in it. James's hand gripping Daniel's, the young man's tears, the older man's resolve. This is not a photograph of heroism in the conventional sense. This is a photograph of two people holding each other up in the face of destruction. This is a photograph of love expressed through refusal, through the decision to stand aside together rather than participate separately. Some promises are made in grand gestures, but some of the most important promises are made silently, through hand contact, through the decision to refuse together what a system demands you accept. James and Daniel made a promise to each other that August morning in 1944. The promise was not explicitly stated, but it was visible in the photograph. I will not abandon you. We will refuse together. Our conscience will matter more than our obedience. That promise persisted for the rest of their lives. James apparently carried it until his death in 1989. Daniel apparently structured his entire post-war existence around it, dedicating himself to the preservation of culture, to the opposite of destruction, to the affirmation that beauty and knowledge and human creativity matter even, or especially, in a world that sometimes demands their annihilation. The photograph reminds us that resistance takes many forms. It can be grand and public, but it can also be quiet and private. Two soldiers standing before flames, holding each other's hand, refusing to participate in destruction. It can be a decision made in a moment, with no guarantee of recognition or acknowledgement. It can be a choice that cost you your entire life, not through death but through the burden of carrying it, the weight of knowing that you refused when you could have complied. Yet in that refusal, something sacred persists. In that moment of standing aside, in that decision to bear witness rather than participate, in that gesture of holding another person's hand before flames, in all of this, something essentially human survives. Something that systems cannot contain or erase or commandeer for their own purposes. The photograph endures. The flames are long extinguished. The chateau is being rebuilt. The art that was destroyed will never exist again. But the image of refusal, of two people choosing conscience over obedience, this image will continue to speak to future generations about what it means to remain human in the face of systematic dehumanization. Some photographs capture more than faces. They capture the moment when humanity asserts itself against systems of destruction. They preserve, for history to eventually discover, the possibility that even in the darkest circumstances, conscience endures. That refusal is possible. That love expressed through solidarity and moral courage remains the most powerful force available to human beings. James and Daniel are gone now, but their refusal persists. And in that persistence, they continue to hold each other's hands across the decades, asking future generations to ask themselves the same question they asked themselves on that August morning in 1944. What am I willing to refuse? What conscience will I stake my life upon? And in this moment of choice, who will I choose to stand beside? These are the questions the photograph preserves. These are the questions history entrusts to us. And in answering them, We honor not merely James and Daniel, but the possibility of human agency, human conscience, and human love operating in resistance to systems designed to eliminate all three.